In the small town of Cedar Hill, where life seemed to move at a slower pace, there was an unspoken rule that had divided the community for generations: people stuck to their own kind. The town's population was split almost evenly between two groups: those who lived on the east side, mostly black families, and those on the west, predominantly white. It was a division everyone seemed to accept, and few dared to challenge it. That was, until a new school year began at Cedar Hill High. Elijah Davis was known as a quiet, thoughtful kid with a love for reading. He had lived on the east side his entire life, surrounded by the same people, the same stories of struggle and strength. His mother, a nurse, always reminded him, "Elijah, the world may not always be fair to you, but your heart must remain fair to the world." On the other side of town was Daniel Thompson, a star athlete, the kind of guy everyone knew or at least wanted to know. Daniel's father owned one of the largest businesses in town, and the Thompsons were well respected on the west side. Daniel's life was set on a path that seemed to have no obstacles, or so everyone thought. Their worlds might have remained completely separate if it weren't for an assignment in Mr. Thompson's history class. The project was to pair up with someone you'd never spoken to and interview each other's families to learn about their histories. The idea was to bridge divides and foster understanding, but most of the students groaned at the thought. No one was eager to cross Cedar Hill's invisible line. Elijah and Daniel ended up as partners purely by chance, or perhaps by fate. The two boys were less than thrilled, exchanging awkward glances as Mr. Thompson announced their names. Daniel had always heard things about those people on the east side, and Elijah couldn't help but remember the stories his friends told about how the kids on the west side looked down on them. Their first meeting was tense. Elijah hesitated outside Daniel's house, a grand two-story structure that seemed a world apart from his own modest home. Daniel answered the door, a forced smile on his face, while his parents watched curiously from the living room. It was clear they were wary of having someone like Elijah in their home. But as the days went on, something began to shift. During their project meetings, Elijah and Daniel discovered a shared love for history. They were fascinated by stories of rebellion and unity, of people standing up against injustice. It became the first thing they bonded over, and slowly, their conversations grew less stilted. When it was time for Daniel to visit Elijah's neighborhood, his unease was palpable. As they walked down the narrow streets, Daniel was quiet, taking in the cramped houses, the kids playing on cracked sidewalks, and the vibrant murals that adorned the walls. He noticed how everyone seemed to know Elijah, greeting him warmly. For the first time, Daniel saw a side of town he had only heard about in passing, and it was different from what he had been led to believe. Inside Elijah's house, the scent of spices filled the air. Elijah's mother welcomed Daniel with a warmth that caught him off guard. Over dinner, Daniel learned more about Elijah's family history, how his grandfather had been part of the civil rights movement, how his father had struggled to find work despite being qualified. These were stories Daniel had never heard in his own home, where his family's conversations rarely went beyond business and the next big game. As the days turned into weeks, the boys began to spend time together beyond the project. Elijah showed Daniel his favorite hidden spots in town, places where he could read and escape the noise. In return, Daniel introduced Elijah to the world of sports, encouraging him to try out for the basketball team. To everyone's surprise, Elijah was a natural, and soon the two were practicing together every weekend. But not everyone was happy about their growing friendship. Whispers started circulating around town. At school, Daniel's friends began to distance themselves, making snide comments whenever Elijah was around. On the east side, some of Elijah's friends warned him, "Don't get too close. He's not like us. He'll never understand." The breaking point came one Friday night. The boys had made it onto the basketball team, and they were playing in a crucial game against a rival school. With the game tied in the final seconds, Elijah made a perfect pass to Daniel, who scored the winning basket. The crowd erupted in cheers, but as the team celebrated, Elijah overheard one of Daniel's friends mutter, "Can't believe he's hanging out with them now." Elijah stormed out of the gym, hurt and angry. Daniel followed, trying to explain, but Elijah cut him off. "You think just because we play on the same team, it makes everything okay?" he shouted. "You don't get it, Daniel. You'll never understand what it's like to live on my side of town." For days, the boys didn't speak. The project was over, and it seemed their fragile friendship had crumbled. But Daniel couldn't let it go. He knew Elijah was right, he didn't understand. But he wanted to. Determined to make things right, Daniel did something no one in his family had ever done before. He showed up at a town council meeting to speak out about the lack of funding for the schools on the east side. He talked about what he had seen, the stories he had heard from Elijah's family, and how the town's divisions were hurting everyone. It was a small gesture, but it made headlines. People took notice, and for the first time, Cedar Hill began to have conversations it had long avoided. When Elijah heard about what Daniel had done, he was stunned. The boy who had once been wary of crossing the town's invisible lines was now trying to break them down. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The next time they met, Elijah simply said, "I heard what you did. Thank you." Daniel smiled, replying, "I had to try. We're not so different, you know. We both just want things to be better." As they walked away together, side by side, the invisible line that had divided them for so long began to blur, showing that sometimes, it takes just one friendship to begin breaking down the walls of prejudice. In Cedar Hill, change came slowly, but it started with two boys who chose to see beyond their differences and find strength in their shared humanity. And while they couldn't change the world overnight, they proved that friendship has the power to defeat even the deepest divides. As news of Daniel's courageous speech at the town council spread, it sparked a ripple effect that neither he nor Elijah could have anticipated. For the first time, the people of Cedar Hill began questioning the barriers that had kept them apart for generations. There were still whispers and resistance from those who clung to the old ways, but change was in the air. The once clear-cut boundary between the east and west sides of town slowly began to blur. Elijah and Daniel's friendship became a symbol of that change, a beacon of hope for those who had long accepted their divisions as unchangeable. They found themselves at the center of something bigger than just a school project or a game-winning basketball shot. Their story inspired others to reach across the lines that had kept them apart for so long. One day, the principal of Cedar Hill High invited the boys to speak at a school assembly. At first, they were reluctant. Public speaking was not exactly in their comfort zone. But as they stood on the stage together, facing their peers, something shifted. The entire school was watching, students from both sides of town who rarely spoke to one another outside of class. Daniel spoke first. "When we were assigned that history project," he began, "I thought it was just another boring assignment. I never thought it would change how I see the world." He glanced at Elijah, who gave him an encouraging nod. "But what I've learned is that the stories we don't know about each other are the ones that keep us apart." Elijah took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. "Growing up, I always heard that people on the other side of town wouldn't care about someone like me," he said. "But what I learned is that sometimes, it's not about where you come from but where you're willing to go together." The auditorium was silent. For a moment, it felt like the air was holding its breath. Then, someone began clapping, first slowly, then more joined in, until the whole room was filled with applause. In that moment, it was as if Cedar Hill had collectively decided to take a step forward. Following the assembly, something remarkable happened. Students who had never interacted before began sitting together at lunch. Teachers noticed a shift in the hallways. Kids who had once walked past each other with cold, indifferent stares now exchanged greetings, even smiles. The invisible lines that had divided the school were beginning to fade, just like they had in the town. But not everyone was on board. One evening, as Daniel was heading home after another late basketball practice, he found a note stuck to his locker. It read, "Traitor," in bold red letters. The message was clear: some people were not ready to let go of their hatred. Daniel crumpled the note, his heart heavy. When he showed it to Elijah, he could see the familiar look of frustration and hurt in his friend's eyes. "This is what I meant," Elijah said quietly. "Some people will never change." But Daniel refused to accept that. "Maybe not everyone," he said, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying." The very next day, Daniel went back to the town council, this time with Elijah by his side. They spoke together, not just about the need for equal funding in schools but about the power of unity. They presented a proposal to start a community program where kids from both sides of town could come together, through sports, arts, and volunteer projects. It was an idea that seemed almost laughable a year ago, but now, it was gaining support. To their surprise, the council approved the program. It started small, with just a few kids showing up to the first event, but word spread quickly. Soon, the community center was filled with laughter, the sounds of basketball games, art workshops, and kids who were discovering that they had more in common than they ever imagined. One afternoon, as Elijah and Daniel watched a group of kids, black and white, playing a heated game of basketball, Elijah turned to his friend. "You know," he said, "if you told me a year ago that we'd be here, I wouldn't have believed you." Daniel grinned, his eyes twinkling with that old mischief. "Yeah, and if you told me I'd have a best friend from the east side, I would have thought you were crazy." The two laughed, but it was a laughter filled with relief and joy. They had proven to themselves, and to Cedar Hill, that real change was possible. Not through speeches or laws alone, but through the power of connection and understanding. Years later, Cedar Hill was a different place. The old divides were no longer as visible, both in the town and in people's hearts. The community program had grown into a yearly tradition, bringing families together who once barely acknowledged each other's existence. Elijah and Daniel, now older and wiser, looked back on their journey with pride. They had shown that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, friendship could bridge the gaps that hatred had created. They had learned that it takes courage to change minds, but even more to open hearts. In the end, it was the friendship of two boys from different sides of town that had sparked a movement. Cedar Hill had become a place where, slowly but surely, people learned to see one another not as strangers, but as neighbors and friends. And as Elijah and Daniel walked through the town they had helped transform, they realized something important: the walls that divide us are only as strong as we allow them to be. And sometimes, all it takes to tear them down is the simple act of reaching out a hand. Years later, Elijah and Daniel stood side by side at the opening of a new community center that had been built on the old dividing line between the east and west sides of Cedar Hill. It was a testament to the unity they had fought for, a place where children of all backgrounds came to play, learn, and grow together. As they cut the ribbon, surrounded by cheering families, Elijah turned to Daniel with a smile. "We really did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "Yeah, we did. And it all started with that history project." Their friendship had not only bridged the divide between them but had sparked a change throughout their town. Cedar Hill was no longer defined by invisible lines but by the connections that bound its people together. And as they watched children of all races playing together without a care in the world, Elijah and Daniel knew that they had created something truly lasting, a legacy of hope, friendship, and the belief that, together, we can overcome even the deepest divides. In the end, Cedar Hill had learned that it wasn't where you came from that mattered, but the bridges you were willing to build. And it all began with two boys who dared to be friends in a town that once tried to keep them apart.